All right, guys, it's great to be with you, and I thank Alessio for that very interesting talk that preceded me. In fact, I think mine kind of forms an interesting pair with it, and I hope you'll feel the same way. My talk today is on the question of, does the brain have a functional unit? And more specifically, it's on this notion of a functional unit and what it is. So you may already be familiar with the notion of a functional unit, or you may have heard people talk about units in the brain this way, or other complex systems. I think this notion has a really interesting history, and I think that it has some interesting things to tell us about the brain and the way it works. And so my talk today is going to be about this notion. So here's a little outline of what I'm going to cover for the next little while. So I'll introduce this topic a little more, and then I'm going to talk about the notion of a functional unit and what I call a functionally fractal system. And I'll tell you more about what that is and why I think it's a useful concept in thinking about the brain and brain function. I'm also going to talk about functional units from a historical perspective. And so I'll have a few quotes and from the history of modern neuroscience to illustrate a little bit of how this concept has been used in the past and how we ought to take it, how kind of what our conceptual inheritance is from this tradition of using this concept in the 20th century. And then I'm going to look at, or I'll make some arguments rather, about contemporary notions of a functional unit and what the brain's functional unit actually is. I'd like to say a few things about that, specifically the synapse. We'll look at a couple others as well, and I'll say a little bit about that. And then I'll offer at the end a few closing remarks about what I call a non-fractal view of the brain. And I think this view of the brain harmonizes with many views that you all probably hold, and I think it captures some of our intuitions about the way we know the brain to be working. So to start off with a little more introduction. So my purposes in this talk and with this paper, kind of a work in progress right now, so I hope there's comments, but my purpose is to develop conceptual resources that will help us clarify the notion of a functional unit. So given the importance of this notion in the history of neuroscience, I think that it's worth paying attention to. And I think that it's worth doing some work in order to try to make it clearer and try to give us a useful concept, both for philosophy of neuroscience and for neuroscientific context. I'd also like to offer a well-developed and empirically informed notion of a functional unit. So actually give a definition for what I think the proper way to understand a functional unit is. And then, and the other purpose is to argue that other views about functional units I think are unsatisfactory for various reasons. So the payoff of this presentation and this paper, I think, is a sharper conception of a functional unit, and specifically a notion that's more responsive to empirical constraints, and that's also more useful for thinking about brain function in both scientific and philosophical contexts. So with that as introduction and background, let me get into this a bit to the topic of functional units and functionally fractal systems. So in order to realize their functions, a complex system relies on interactions among many different parts. So we learn about the mechanisms which carry out functions by studying these parts, and we study how they interact. And when we do this, we assume that at least some of the things we learn about the parts are going to be relevant to the functions of the whole. So for example, think of studying visual perception. When we study visual perception, we learn about opsin proteins in retinal cells. And we assume that at least some facts about these proteins are relevant to understanding visual perception. And in fact, some of these facts are relevant. So opsin proteins are light sensitive. They undergo a conformational change when they're struck by photons or when they absorb photons. And this causes them to transduce an environmental signal, that is the photon, into a biochemical signal. And then a cascade of other biochemical responses follow this opsin conformational change, which eventually leads to the formation of a visual image. So when we study complex systems or a complex process like visual perception, we assume that what we're learning about the bits, the parts, is in some way relevant to the function of the whole. But at the same time, we also assume that some of the things we learn about a system's parts are not relevant to the functions of the whole. So when we study a desktop computer, for example, we will learn about the fans, which distribute cool air across the computer's power supply and across its processors. So especially at high speeds, the components of a computer produce a lot of excess heat. And the heat has to be removed in order for the computer to continue to function in the right way. So while the fan is a necessary part of implementing the computer's functions in a physical system, the fan is actually irrelevant itself to those functions considered strictly in themselves. In other words, none of the fan's inputs or outputs, if we could call them that, nor the manner or the speed at which it spins, none of these things constitute any part of the computations that are carried out by the computer. So we have this difference between function and implementation. And this is a well-known problem in many different fields in the philosophy of science. And when we think about complex systems like this, it's natural to think in terms of what we can call a functional unit. So to start off, you might already have an idea or an intuitive idea of what a functional unit is. You could say it's whatever thing is inside the system that's actually doing the stuff that makes the system what it is. That's kind of a vague definition, but I think it captures the idea that the little things on the inside of the system are doing things. They have causal relations to each other and sometimes to components on the outside of the system. And through what they're able to do, they bring about the functions of the whole. So a bit more precisely, we can say that a functional unit is a building block of a system's functions. So in a complex system, there may be multiple types of functional units, multiple functional unit types, or there may be only one type, and we'll see some examples of these. And the notion of a functional unit also helps us out to some extent with this problem of function versus implementation. It's not, in many systems, it's not a trivial question which parts are relevant to the function of the system. So in artificial systems or systems we create ourselves, like a computer, for example, in a sense, it's somewhat easy to tell which parts of the system are relevant to the function of the whole. In other systems, it's not always so easy, and it's not a trivial question which parts are relevant. And I think this is the case for the brain. I'd like to draw a parallel with the kidney. So the kidney is a complex system which has a single functional unit. So what I think this means is that we can understand what the kidney does by understanding what the parts of the kidney do. So this functional unit in the kidney is called a nephron. Now, in saying that a kidney does have a functional unit, we don't mean that by learning about the nephron, we exhaust our knowledge of the kidney. Rather, we're thinking here in terms of function and replicability across the system. That is, what's at stake is the patterns of units being spread throughout the kidney. And I think the functions of the kidney are exhausted by the functions of the parts. There is no emergent function in the kidney or some function over and above the functions of the parts. So the functional description of the whole is equivalent to the functional description of the parts. That is, they play the very same role. So the kidney's function is to cleanse the blood, and a nephron's function is to cleanse the blood. They share this functional description at an important level of granularity or an important level of description. Now, I'm curious to hear what people think about this. I gave this presentation recently here at Duke and had a doctor who had studied the kidney call me out on the kidney example. So we'll see what you all think about this. But the functional unit of the kidney, again, is the nephron. So here's a schematic diagram of a nephron from a 1988 paper that established a certain naming convention for these parts of the nephron. So a nephron is a renal corpuscle, that is a body in the kidney, which links to this tube that twists around and it drains into a duct. And so human kidneys contain about 1 million of these nephrons. And the nephrons taken together give the kidney its basic structure. And nephrons are the kidney's functional unit. So various parts of the nephron perform various jobs. The glomerulus filters the blood. The renal tubules reabsorb water into the blood and so on. And there's different parts of the nephron which work with electrolytes and other important physiological aspects of kidney function. And different parts of the nephron correspond to different aspects of kidney function. So without exaggeration, I think we can say that one learns about what kidneys do by learning what nephrons do. Now, I think this makes kidneys a special type of system. They're what I call a functionally fractal system. So I define a functionally fractal system in the following way. A functionally fractal system is one with the following two features. One is that the system's overall function is roughly the same as that of its parts. And two, the system carries out that function by the repetition of a stereotyped structure or pattern of structures. Now, that stereotyped unit or pattern of units in the second condition is the functional unit. And so this is how we connect our talk of fractal systems or functionally fractal systems to the concept of a functional unit. The stereotyped pattern or structure or pattern of structures is the functional unit of the complex system. Now, the notion of a fractal, this term fractal, comes from a tradition of complexity and analysis of nonlinear systems. And so in trying to come up with a reductive term to describe these functionally fractal systems, it may seem like there's a weird tension between the term fractal and the kinds of systems I'm trying to describe. All I mean by fractal is the two conditions above that you can see in the slide, not anything else that the actual analysis of fractal systems carries with it. So the term functionally fractal also has this nice double F alliteration that's like difficult to give up when you come up with it, you know. But I think this does help us understand a little bit of what's going on with the kidney when we think of what its properties are as a functional, as a complex system. Along with a functionally fractal system, I think we can define a notion of a fractal functional unit. So I define a fractal functional unit as one, a unit that has that is a stereotyped structure or pattern of structures, in virtue of which a system carries out its functions. And two, this pattern or the structure or pattern of structures is repeated throughout the whole, regularly throughout the system. Now, we specifically care about condition number 2 here. So you can think about a car. A car is a complex system that has many different types of functional units. So in this respect, it's different from the kidney. The kidney has a single functional unit. A car has many different types of functional units. When you look in the car, or when you analyze the car's function, you don't just find one stereotype structure or pattern of structures repeated throughout the system. You don't find, for example, that the engine is composed of tiny steering wheels or anything like that, right? That's not what you find. In the car, there are multiple functional units that do lots of different things. And all of these things are required, or many of them, in order to make the car drive. So the kidney is a complex system with a crucial difference with respect to a car. And I think that difference, we can capture it in terms of functionally fractal systems and fractal functional units. Okay, so now let's turn to the brain and think about how we can apply some of these concepts and conceptual resources to help us understand some of the things we learn about the brain in neuroscience. So as with the kidney, the question for the brain is, what do you need to study in order to understand the brain's functions? What do we need to study in order to understand the brain's functions? So do we believe that the brain has a single functional unit, maybe the neuron perhaps? Or is the brain more like a car with a wide variety of functional units that do very different things? We can also ask, does having identified a functional unit then answer the question of what we need to study? Now, I think that this is the view that some people actually do have. So here are a couple of examples where we see claims like this being made in neuroscientific literature. So Mayford et al. In 2012 claimed that the synapse is the functional unit of the brain. And Nicolalis in 2008 writes of an ever-growing consensus that distributed populations of neurons, rather than single neurons, define the true functional unit of the nervous system. So not the synapse, but populations of neurons. And I think population coding, specifically population activity, is what's being referred to here. And there's also a great paper by Rosa Cow, who some of you may know, on this topic of a functional unit. And I apologize to Rosa, who I know is not here, but I feel I should apologize anyway for not including her work in this slide. She has a great paper on this that I encourage you to check out. Now, looking at these quotes in this slide, I interpret these remarks in a strong sense, which means that in making these claims about what the brain's functional unit is, these authors are also making claims about what we need to study in order to understand how the brain gives rise to cognition. Okay? Now, it's tempting to interpret these remarks in a weaker sense, where the authors would be saying something like, hey, the synapse is really important. That would be Mayford. Or Nicolalis, hey, populations and population codes, they're really important, guys. You should pay attention to them. But I think we really need to insist on a stronger interpretation here of these types of remarks, where authors are committing to a certain view about what we need to study in order to understand cognition, and by the same token, what we can ignore in studying cognition. So I don't think these claims are very interesting otherwise. They certainly aren't controversial, and they're really not even worth making. So I think we ought to insist on a strict or strong interpretation of these sorts of remarks about functional units. Now the brain, turning back to the brain again, will not be functionally fractal in the same sense as the kidney for the following reason. The functional descriptions of interest are not going to be equivalent, or even roughly equivalent, between the units and the whole. So if we wanted to make them equivalent between the brain and its parts, our functional descriptions would have to be so vague that they'd be unhelpful in understanding how the brain actually works. So for example, we could say that the function of the brain is to process information, and the function of a unit like the neuron is also to process information. Now this is true in a sense, but it's not very illuminating when you think about this description at the level of the brain. In fact, many systems can be considered to be information processing systems in loose senses. So you can think of photons being absorbed by some object and some other photons being reflected. So the object takes inputs, performs a transformation on those inputs, and sends forth an output. This is not very interesting to think of an object like that in an information processing sense. So we don't care about the brain's functionally fractalness, if I can use that term, in exactly the same way as we do for a kidney. But the concept of a functionally fractal system, I think, is still helpful for thinking about the brain because it concentrates our attention on stereotyped patterns of units. That's the key here, stereotyped patterns of units. And I think Alessio has already spoken a little bit to some of these issues in his presentation. So in my new frame of thinking about functional units, the notion has two features. The overall function is roughly the same as that of its parts, and the system carries out that function by the repetition of a stereotyped pattern or pattern of units. Now, I don't think the brain meets the first condition of this definition, but I think it may meet the second. That is, it carries out this function by the repetition of a stereotyped unit or pattern of units. So the question is, does it meet the second, and would it be interesting if it did? What would we learn about the brain if it did meet this condition? In a functionally fractal system, we find the same stereotyped pattern repeated again and again. The brain might be a complex system in a sense. So to flesh out this notion of a functional unit a bit more, I've done some conceptual analysis, and I've offered up a few different ways of thinking about this term in relation to certain types of complex systems. But I'd like to turn to the history of modern neuroscience briefly to uncover a few more pointers that have been given to us in trying to understand the notion of a functional unit with respect to the brain. So I'll start with Ramon y Cajal, where really all of modern neuroscience begins. I think he's the father of the functional unit concept, at least when it comes to the brain. So for Ramon y Cajal, the functional unit of the brain was the neuron. And this statement had a strong interpretation for him. The functional unit, the only functional unit of the brain was the neuron. Neurons are an obvious choice for the functional unit since they're a basic structural unit in the nervous system. And when you take a neuron as the functional unit, it can mean that explanations of the brain functions would refer to the properties of individual neurons and their interactions. And this is the view that's now called the Neuron Doctrine. The Neuron Doctrine is a view about what we need to study about the brain in order to understand cognition. And it says that what we need to study is individual neurons and their interactions. Now, I think the way that neuroscience is taught nowadays assumes that the neuron really is the functional unit. So if you press neuroscientists, most of them will refer to one single neuron as the basic functional object in the brain. And there's a historical precedent here. Neuroscientists think that the neuron is the functional unit because they think that no other cell types matter for understanding cognition. Now, I'm not saying they think that no other interactions matter. In fact, we actually know that other types of interactions, especially involving glia, do matter for cognition. But in actually studying the brain, especially in cognitive neuroscience, for the purposes of cognition, people assume that neurons are the important thing and not glia or some other unit. And cells and structures other than neurons play a correspondingly supportive role in producing cognition. So there's a difference here between function and implementation. So the Neuron Doctrine, I think, still is interpreted in a strong way and exercises to this day, more than 100 years after the pioneering work of Ramon y Cajal, the Neuron Doctrine still exercises to some extent a controlling influence on the way that people think about brain function. Now, Ramon and Cajal had a student named Rafael Lorente Deneau, and Deneau offered a challenge to the neuron as a functional unit. He called it the neuron chain. So his work on cortical anatomy led him to propose that the neuron chain was the brain's functional unit. So take a look at the first quote here. Lorente Deneau, we find him saying, according to this view, the fundamental factors in the nervous system are neither single neurons nor elementary reflex arcs, but chains of neurons. So he said these chains showed a, quote, multiplicity of connections, and he also said that the chains could be called elementary units. That's the second quote. And for Lorente Deneau, these neuron chains, exactly what he meant by this term is not really clear, but it's clear that he took it as the functional unit. So neuron chains, their structure and function was taken as a template for understanding structure and function throughout the brain. And so this was going to be accomplished by identifying chains in all cortical areas. The third quote on our slide here. He says, many, if not all, cortical regions are characterized by specific structural traits, according to which the cortex is considered as a chain of neurons. And so different view about what might constitute a functional unit. Coming closer to our present day, 1972, with the work of Gordon Shepard, who was quoted in Alessio's presentation previously. So according to Shepard, the Neuron Doctrine assumes that the morphological neuron is a single functional entity, and all types of neurons are functionally similar or equivalent. Again, this is a strong interpretation of the Neuron Doctrine, and I think that Shepard has got it right here, that there's something about a repeated pattern. But with an eye toward explaining more complex physiological and psychological functions, Shepard writes that the neuron can no longer be regarded as the basic functional unit of the nervous system. Rather, the nervous system is organized on the basis of functional units whose identity in many cases is independent of neuronal boundaries. So Shepard's push, now almost 50 years ago, opens up the notion of a functional unit beyond a single stereotyped pattern or single stereotyped structure. Since functions vary greatly, he says, quote, in order to identify these functions, we need to free the term functional unit from its association with the entire neuron, end quote. So consequently, we could make functional attributions to structures such as cortical areas, cortical columns, and cell ensembles. And these structural units, he says, would be subsumed under a general concept of functional units of varying degrees of extent and complexity. So a different view about functional units opening up the notion beyond just a single stereotyped pattern that you'd find throughout the brain in different brain areas. So taking a historical view, from these quotes during the first century of modern neuroscience, the idea of a functional unit has been an important concept and did exercise a strong influence over how investigators thought about the brain. And as a result, today, I think, this concept of a functional unit guides our thinking in what we think we need to understand, or excuse me, what we think we need to study in order to understand the brain as a whole. So turning now then from this historical view and keeping in mind this background that I've proposed for understanding a functional unit, I'd like to make a couple of arguments against contemporary ideas about what functional units actually are. So we saw Mayford et al. Making a claim about the synapse as a functional unit. So there are important advantages to taking the synapse as a functional unit. So the sender and receiver states of the synaptic complex are fairly easy to model because you can ignore biological variability across synapses. And we know that synapses are important or functionally important for cognition. So for example, modification of synaptic connections plays a role in memory consolidation and learning and other cognitive processes. So we know synapses are important for cognition. And finally, when we measure information states in the brain, synapses appear to give us more information than individual neurons do. So if you take the whole neuron as a sender-receiver, doing so erases information that's contained in individual synapses about activation levels, because synapses can integrate many inputs without causing new action potentials. So the synapse seems like a good functional unit to propose, given what we know now about the brain. So I think these commitments in taking the synapse as a functional unit lead to an objection to the synapse as functional unit. And that objection is the existence of alternative means of information processing. So the synapse is usually taken as a functional unit on the basis that it is the key unit of information processing. This is where all the action is happening. But there are at least three important non-synaptic means of neural signaling. So the first is through gap junctions, which are direct neuron-to-neuron connections. So gap junctions allow neurons to pass ions and molecules, or in other words, signals, independently of the regular synapse. Gap junctions just to clarify, are also called electrical synapses, but the structure of electrical synapses is different from that of a regular or chemical synapse. So a second means of non-synaptic neural signaling is volume transmission. Volume transmission occurs when a signaling molecule is dumped into extracellular space, in which diffuses in all directions without targeting a particular neuron or synapse. And molecules that are transmitted in this way can have powerful effects on cellular and therefore cognitive activities. And a third means of non-neuronal signaling, which I won't say much about, is but which appears in new work that's just come out this year, is that neurons even appear to communicate through non-synaptic mRNA transfer mediated by this gene ARC. So in response to the view that synapses may constitute the functional unit of the brain, I think there are objections based on our knowledge of different kinds of signaling systems, non-synaptic signaling systems in the brain. Now, population level activity is another intriguing candidate for a functional unit. We saw this quote from Nicolelis earlier. It's especially intriguing when you think of the success of brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs. So a BCI links a computer to a multi-electrode recording device, such that the computer or a machine can be controlled by recorded neural activities, like a prosthetic limb, for example. So if population level activity, which is what the electrode records, if population level activity can correctly manipulate the movement of a mechanical arm, then perhaps it ought to be considered a functional unit too. That is the population level activity itself. In addition to population level activity, brain circuits and networks have a similar appeal as functional units. So many functions, for example, require distributed patterns of activity in multi-neuron circuits, and higher cognitive functions are thought to depend on brain-wide network dynamics. And circuits have a natural advantage as a functional unit since they're mini networks. They scale easily from a handful of neurons to hundreds of millions of neurons. And there's also a very long philosophical tradition of using neural networks to understand many aspects of cognition and representation. So this is best exemplified, I think, in the work of Paul Churchland. Now, there are some other, I would say, less plausible possibilities for neural functional units as well, in addition to circuits, networks, population codes. These include cortical layers, cortical columns, maybe cortical traveling waves from recent research, glia themselves, dendritic branches, and there are other possibilities as well. And the possibilities become even more numerous when we think about how neuromodulation can drastically alter the behavior of all of these structures. I think in response to these possibilities of different functional units, neuroscientific evidence is suggesting the following 2 points. So one is that all the neural structures I've mentioned as candidates for functional units really can receive legitimate functional descriptions. They can all be considered to be involved in functions and take on functional descriptions correctly themselves. And in addition, these structures' ways of functioning are too disparate to be summarized in useful generalizations. So I think that looking to the brain for what we could call, and what I have called, a fractal functional unit, a single functional unit in the brain, looks unwise. In order for that to be the case, in order for the brain to have a fractal functional unit or a single functional unit in this sense, we would have to show that all important cognitive functions are to be explained by reference to the stereotyped application and properties of this single neural type, whatever that functional unit is. But I don't think this is likely to occur. Other functional units, or different functional units, explain the activities of different functions, and different structural types are involved in many different types of functions. So I think the simplest conclusion to make here is that the functional unit concepts understood as some authors understand them in a strong sense of there being a single functional unit in the brain, which is the thing we need to study in order to understand what's going on in the brain. I think this is not the right way to view things. There are many different candidates for a functional unit, but none is really flexible enough to fill all the roles that we need the notion to fill. So to finish up in the next few minutes, I'll offer what I call a non-fractal view of the brain. So I'll suggest a definition of a functional unit here. It is a functional unit is the structural correlate for some function. So we want our definition of a functional unit to apply to many levels of organization, from neurobiology to functional connectivity networks, which we get from neuroimaging data. And on more abstract network perspectives, the units don't have a definite physical anchor. And so networks, in addition, don't always have well-defined nodes, for example. And so we can't always count on networks or other structures in the brain to have clear morphological substrates. And so my term structural correlate in this definition includes less determinate entities like nodes and networks, but also more determinate entities like ion channels, synapses, and clearly defined neural circuits. So on my view, it's not a requirement that functional units have obvious physical anchors. So I'm also going to suggest the following principles to guide our understanding of the notion of a functional unit. So some of these principles are already exemplified in modern neuroscience and in philosophy of neuroscience as well, especially in thinking about mechanisms. And I think that it's a virtue of my understanding of a functional unit that these principles are useful, since I think they represent a great deal of what we know about the brain, or principles to guide our thinking about the brain. So the first is that functional units are formed at several levels of organization. And the nervous system is built of overlapping assemblies and hierarchies of such units that increase in extent and complexity. Okay, so we already know that this is the case, that we can have mechanisms nested in other mechanisms, nested in other mechanisms. And functional units are formed at several levels of organization in the same way. And functional units may capture some of what we think about mechanisms in this sense as well. Second principle, the psychological functions and behavior arise from the interactions of many different functional units at many levels of organization. So in other words, there is no, I like to put it this way, there's no skeleton key to the brain. There's no one single functional unit whose stereotyped application across the brain is going to uncover for us what's going on in cognition, especially in behavior. And then the third principle, depending on the context, a single functional unit can receive multiple functional descriptions. Excuse me. So the third principle acknowledges the many-to-many nature of structure-to-function relationships in the brain. And I think something like this third principle is the guiding force behind new theoretical frameworks such as neural reuse and cognitive recycling that have been offered in philosophy and neuroscience literature. So a context here is fixed by properties such as effective connectivity, environmental variables, and other properties of the brain. And depending on what the context is, a single functional unit can receive different functional descriptions and perhaps even competing or even incompatible functional descriptions, depending on how this context is set. So to conclude, or to wrap up a little bit and reflect on this notion of a functional unit, the question is, does the brain have a functional unit? I don't think that it has a fractal functional unit, even though many structures and patterns of structures are spoken about in this way in neuroscience literature. So there is no nephron in the brain. Unfortunately, nature hasn't been so kind to us to give us this one single thing that we can focus on. And I think that this tells us something important about the brain as a whole. My takeaway is that depending on the context, a single functional unit can receive multiple functional descriptions. And I think this does have important implications for how we should think about functions that are carried out by neural structures. And I think this notion of a functional unit and the definitions that I've offered are valuable both for thinking about the brain from a scientific perspective and from a philosophical perspective. Thank you.